These people don't belong here. This is private property." The words, sharp and cold, sliced through the tranquil beach air. "I told you they were criminals. I knew it. Lock them all up." The speaker was a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that whispered of wealth. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her manicured finger pointing accusingly at a family standing frozen on the sand. "I need police, immediately," she said into her phone, her voice a symphony of fake urgency and manufactured concern. "There's a suspicious black family with a child on our private beach." Her tone was shrill, laced with the vindication of someone who believed they had just solved the crime of the century. She practically bounced on her designer sneakers, giddy with the thrill of being right about these people who had dared to set foot on her territory. Soon, the menacing wail of sirens cut through the sound of the waves. Police vehicles arrived, ready to deal with the perceived threat of a black family enjoying a day at the beach. The officers treated the situation with the gravity of a major bust, their movements rough, aggressive, and utterly convinced of their righteousness. The lead officer, a man who carried himself like the star of his own cop show, barked orders, clearly believing he had just saved the neighborhood from a terrible menace. And then, the story took a turn that no one saw coming. In the distance, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows sped towards them, their approach unnervingly fast. They were federal government vehicles, the kind that signal something significant is about to unfold. They screeched to a halt, and in a synchronized flurry of motion, car doors slammed open. Men and women in crisp black suits emerged, moving with a purpose and authority that commanded immediate attention. They wore sunglasses and had badges hanging from their necks. They meant business. The local police officers, moments ago so confident, now looked confused, perhaps even a little nervous. But the moment that changed everything came from the man in handcuffs. The man who had been treated like a criminal. He slowly turned to face the officers who had arrested him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and carried an authority that cut through the chaos like a razor. Looking directly at the lead officer, he said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your lives." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of careers ending and lawsuits being born. The blonde woman, once so sure of herself, now looked as if she'd seen a ghost. The officer's expressions morphed from confidence to confusion to absolute terror in the space of 3 seconds. Before we uncover how this incredible situation came to be, if you stand against injustice and prejudice, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Type "justice" in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. You'll receive a heartwarming reply from us, because this story is an emotional roller coaster you will never forget. Now, you might be wondering how a simple family vacation could escalate into such an explosive confrontation. How did a day that began with a father, mother, and daughter seeking a peaceful moment by the sea end with federal agents, arrests, and a shocking revelation? What started as an act of discrimination and hatred would spiral into federal investigations and consequences that reached far beyond that single stretch of sand. The people who thought they were in control were about to discover their monumental error, and a family that was victimized would find justice in a way no one could have predicted. But to understand this incredible moment, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a family who just wanted to spend some quality time together, and to the woman whose prejudice set off a chain of events that would change all of their lives forever. First, meet Darius Blackwell. At 45 years old, he had achieved something extraordinary. He wasn't just an FBI agent. He was the chief of the Counterterrorism Division, one of the most powerful and respected positions in federal law enforcement. This was a man who had clawed his way up from the poorest neighborhoods of Detroit, a world of violence, drugs, and despair. For 20 long years, Darius had dedicated his life to the Bureau, working nights, weekends, and holidays. He'd missed birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings, sacrificing his personal life to prove he belonged in a world that often viewed men who looked like him with suspicion. Every case solved, every criminal captured, every plot foiled. It all led to this. He was the chief, responsible for protecting the nation, and he commanded the respect of agents across the country. But that success came at a price. Darius hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years. 3 years of non-stop work, of carrying the weight of national security on his shoulders, of being on call 24/7. His phone was a constant presence, a relentless harbinger of the next crisis. Then there was his wife, Keisha Blackwell. At 42, she was the heart of their family. A pediatric nurse by profession, she brought that same nurturing spirit to her marriage and to their daughter. She had been married to Darius for 18 beautiful, challenging years, and she understood the weight he carried. She knew his job was a calling, a responsibility that could mean the difference between life and death for countless people. She had learned to live with the late-night calls, the sudden departures, and the constant quiet worry that came with loving a man who put his life on the line for others. And finally, their pride and joy. 8-year-old Amara Blackwell, a girl brilliant beyond her years. She had her father's determination and her mother's compassion, along with a fiery passion for science that amazed everyone she met. But more than anything, Amara was a daddy's girl. She worshipped her father, fascinated by his work and dreaming of one day fighting bad guys just like him. She didn't fully grasp the details of his job, but she knew he was important. She knew he was her hero. For Amara, this vacation wasn't just a trip, it was her very first time seeing the ocean. She had spent weeks preparing, researching marine biology, and planning the water samples she would collect, her dreams filled with the incredible creatures she might find in the tide pools. On the other side of this story was a woman whose life was about to intersect with the Blackwells in the most destructive way imaginable. Her name was Brielle Ashworth, a 38-year-old real estate agent whose life had recently fallen apart. Once successful and comfortable, Brielle had watched her world crumble. Her husband left her for a younger woman, her career began to falter, and the vacation rentals she owned were losing money. Facing a reality she never imagined, alone, struggling, and bitter, Brielle looked for someone to blame. In her mind, the problem wasn't her own choices or circumstances. It was the outsiders moving into her neighborhood, threatening the exclusive community she felt entitled to. She had appointed herself its unofficial protector, a vigilant guardian against anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of belonging. So, when the Blackwell family arrived at Seaside Heights for what they hoped would be a peaceful vacation, they had no idea they were about to cross paths with a woman whose bitterness was a loaded gun waiting for a target. The Blackwells pulled up to their rental on a beautiful sunny morning. For the first time in years, Darius actually looked relaxed. His phone was tucked away, his work emails ignored. He was focused entirely on his wife and daughter. It was such a rare sight that Keisha couldn't help but smile. They had booked this rental months ago, paid their dues just like everyone else, and had every legal right to be there, including access to the private beach, a key reason they'd chosen this spot. For a city family, the promise of a quiet, safe place for Amara to explore was priceless. As they unloaded the car, the air buzzed with excitement. Beach toys, comfortable chairs, and Amara's precious science kit, complete with test tubes, pH strips, and collection jars. The moment they were unpacked, Amara was a blur of motion, skipping ahead toward the beach access path, her backpack bouncing as she chattered about the experiments she would conduct. Behind her, Darius and Keisha walked hand in hand, soaking in a perfect family moment. Keisha looked at her husband. The stress lines around his eyes had softened. His shoulders were relaxed. For once, he was truly present. But their perfect moment was about to be shattered. As they reached the beach, Amara ran ahead, immediately engrossed in the tide pools, her focus as intense as any seasoned scientist. She was carefully gathering water samples, completely absorbed, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just feet away. That's when Brielle Ashworth appeared. She had been inspecting her properties when she spotted the family on what she considered her exclusive beach. In her mind, she knew who belonged here and who didn't. Without a second thought, without a shred of decency, she marched towards them, her energy radiating hostility. She looked directly at Darius and Keisha, and in a condescending, venomous tone, she said, "Excuse me, you people don't belong here. This is private property." And just like that, a perfect family vacation became a federal incident that would make national news, end careers, and expose the ugly truth of what happens when prejudice collides with reality. What followed would test everything this family believed in, challenge their very notions of justice, and reveal a truth that would shock everyone involved, most of all, Brielle herself, who had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Keisha's heart began to race. Every instinct screamed that this was about to get bad. She knew, as a Black woman, that her response in this moment could mean the difference between safety and tragedy. With trembling hands, she reached into her bag and pulled out their rental agreement. Documentation, she had learned, was the first line of defense, even if it often didn't matter when someone's mind was already made up. "Ma'am," Keisha said, her voice as steady as she could make it, "we're staying at the rental property right over there. Here's our agreement showing we have full access to this beach." Brielle barely glanced at the paper before dismissing it with an arrogant wave. "These look fake," she declared. "I know every family that can afford to stay in this neighborhood, and you people are definitely not one of them." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a toxin. This wasn't about a rental agreement, this was about race. Darius stepped forward, his calm authority a product of 20 years in law enforcement. He pulled out his wallet, showing his driver's license, credit card receipts, and confirmation emails. "Ma'am, I understand your concern for security," he said, his voice professional. "We're here on vacation just like everyone else." But Brielle wasn't interested in facts. "Vacation?" she scoffed, a bitter, mocking sound. "In this neighborhood? I don't think so. You're probably casing houses. That's what people like you do, isn't it?" Keisha's voice began to tremble. "Ma'am, we just want to enjoy our time," she pleaded, her voice a near whisper. "We're not causing any trouble." But the terror was building in her chest. This was the nightmare she always feared, confronted by an angry, irrational person, with her young daughter watching it all. For Darius, this was an impossible choice. His law enforcement instincts screamed at him to de-escalate, to protect his family. But another part of him, the FBI chief, felt a grim need to see this through. He could flash his badge and end it all in an instant. But he knew that millions of other black families didn't have that shield. He wanted to witness firsthand what they endured. It was a decision that would haunt him. But in that moment, he chose to let it play out, to see the system for what it was. Meanwhile, little Amara, confused and frightened, started to cry. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging on Keisha's shirt. "Why is she so mean to us? What did we do wrong?" The sight of a crying child should have given Brielle pause, but she was fueled by a bitterness that had nothing to do with this family. Her hostility was a symptom of her own failures, her failed marriage, her failing business, her failing life. She saw them not as people but as symbols of everything that had gone wrong. As the confrontation escalated, other beachgoers began to gather. Some looked uncomfortable, but a few nodded in agreement with Brielle. "Yeah, they don't look like they belong here," one man muttered. "Someone should call security," a woman added. The crowd's support emboldened Brielle. She took out her phone and started taking pictures, a prosecutor gathering evidence. That was the line. Darius discreetly pulled out his own phone and sent a short, coded text to his team. "Need backup. Situation escalating. Bring credentials." The message was brief, but it had just set in motion a chain of events that would bring the full weight of the federal government down upon this quiet, sunny beach. Keisha watched her husband's fingers move across his phone screen. A part of her, a small, insistent voice, wanted to ask who he was texting. But she couldn't speak. She was a statue of fear, her entire being focused on the shield she formed around her daughter. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that any word she uttered could pour gasoline on this fire. As Brielle circled them, her phone held up like a weapon, her accusations spitting into the salty air. Amara's cries grew more desperate. The little girl's fingers were clenched in the fabric of Keisha's dress. "Mommy," she sobbed, her small voice breaking. "Why is she being so mean to us?" Keisha pulled Amara tighter, her own voice trembling as she tried to weave a blanket of comfort from threads of sheer terror. "It's okay, baby. Stay close to Mommy. Everything's going to be okay." But the words felt like lies on her tongue. She saw the venom in Brielle's eyes, heard the murmurs of support rippling through the gathering crowd, and felt the situation spinning into a vortex from which there was no escape. Then Brielle unleashed an accusation so outrageous, so completely untethered from reality, that it would irrevocably alter the course of the day. She looked at this family, a father standing guard, a mother cradling her terrified child, and saw a monster of her own making. "See?" she shrieked, her finger jabbing towards Amara. "Look how terrified that child is. They're probably trafficking her. This isn't a family vacation, it's a kidnapping." The accusation was a shard of madness. It should have been dismissed, laughed away by anyone with a shred of common sense. But in the thick, charged atmosphere of fear and suspicion Brielle had cultivated, her words found fertile ground in minds already primed to believe the worst. Before anyone could process the insanity, Brielle was dialing 911. The call she was about to make would elevate this beachside harassment into a federal incident. 911, what is your emergency? A calm voice answered. I need police immediately. Brielle's voice was a masterful performance of manufactured urgency. There's a suspicious black family on our private beach. I think it's a human trafficking situation. The man has suspicious equipment. The woman looks absolutely terrified. The child is in distress. You need to send multiple units. This could be serious. Every word was a calculated lie, designed to summon armed officers to descend upon an innocent family. As Brielle ended the call, a triumphant smirk on her face, Keisha felt her world fracture. She leaned into her husband, her whisper a ghost of a sound. Darius, I'm scared. Darius looked into his wife's eyes, and his heart broke. This was supposed to be their escape, a time for laughter and memories. Instead, his wife was trembling, his daughter was hysterical, and they were about to be treated like criminals. Stay calm, baby, he whispered back, his voice a low anchor in the storm. Let me handle this. Keisha nodded, but her arms tightened around Amara, a desperate, silent prayer. She'd seen too many news stories, heard too many warnings from friends and family to believe that innocence was a reliable shield. And in the distance, a faint wail began to rise, the sound of sirens growing closer. What no one on that beach knew, not Brielle, not the murmuring crowd, not the 911 dispatcher, was that they had just triggered a chain of events that would expose a truth far more shocking than they could ever imagine. The man they had condemned as a criminal was about to reveal an identity that would change all their lives forever. The sirens grew into an oppressive roar as two police cruisers sped towards the beach, their flashing lights painting the scene in frantic strokes of red and blue. The first officer to emerge was a man in his 40s named Murphy. He moved with the heavy, world-weary gait of a man who had worn a badge for too long without ever being questioned. His personnel file was thick with complaints that had vanished into bureaucratic mist. Behind him was his partner, Stevens, younger and more impressionable, a man who had learned early that survival meant following Murphy's lead. The moment their boots hit the sand, their hands went to their weapons, not their notepads, not their radios, their guns. In their minds, they were not responding to a trespassing dispute. They were confronting a potential human trafficker. Murphy's eyes swept the scene and landed on Darius standing protectively over his family. He saw a black man, a frightened woman, a crying child, and his mind filled in the rest with the ink of his own prejudice. "Step away from the child, now!" Murphy barked, his voice a weapon designed to intimidate, not to protect. The command struck the family like a physical blow. Darius, drawing on 2 decades of experience in de-escalating hostile situations, kept his voice even. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," he said, reaching slowly for his wallet. "We're guests at the rental property next door. I have all the documentation." But Murphy wasn't interested in documentation. He had already written the script in his head. "Could be fake," he sneered, barely glancing at the rental agreements and IDs Darius offered. He gestured to his partner. Stevens moved in and began to search Darius, his hands rough and invasive. It was a needless, humiliating display meant to assert dominance, not ensure safety. Keisha watched in horror, her worst nightmares unfolding in the bright afternoon sun. Murphy then turned his attention to her. "Ma'am, is this man threatening you?" he asked, his tone implying the impossibility of a black man and woman simply being a family on vacation. Keisha was so paralyzed with fear she could barely form words. "No, officer," she whispered. He's my husband." Murphy's eyes narrowed, misinterpreting her terror completely. "Are you sure? You look scared. If he's forcing you to say that, you can tell me." The irony was a blade in her heart. She was terrified, but not of the loving man she'd been married to for 18 years. She was terrified of the men in uniform who were tearing her family apart based on the color of their skin. I'm just nervous around police," she managed to say. Murphy then knelt slightly to address Amara. "Are you okay, sweetie?" he asked the sobbing 8-year-old. "Are these people hurting you?" The question was so surreal, so utterly disconnected from the truth that Darius knew he had to intervene. The situation was out of control. "Officers," he said, his voice still steady despite the rage simmering beneath it. "I'm law enforcement myself. We can handle this professionally." Murphy actually laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Sure you are," he said. "That's what they all say. Next you'll tell me you're the director of the FBI." Despite the complete lack of evidence, despite the proof of their legitimacy, Murphy made the decision that would detonate his career. "You're under arrest," he announced, pulling out his handcuffs with a look of grim satisfaction. "Trespassing, child endangerment." The moment Keisha saw the steel cuffs, she broke. "Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Please, don't hurt him." "Ma'am, step back," Murphy ordered, shoving her husband's arms behind his back. Meanwhile, Brielle was practically vibrating with vindication. "I knew it," she shouted to the crowd. "Lock him up. I told you they were criminals." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Darius's wrists, Amara became hysterical, her screams tearing through the air. The sight of his daughter's terror should have given any decent human being pause, but Murphy was too deep in his narrative to see reality. He wasn't finished. "We need to call Child Protective Services," he announced. At those words, a primal fear seized Keisha. The thought that they might take her daughter, that this nightmare could shatter her family forever, was unbearable. "No, don't take my baby," she cried, clutching Amara as if her grip alone could hold their world together. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Stevens's face. He looked from the sobbing mother to his smirking partner, a growing unease settling in his gut, but he was weak and too afraid of Murphy to intervene. He stood by and did nothing. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a new sound cut through the chaos, the low rumble of powerful engines. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows and government plates rolled onto the access road, moving with an unnerving purpose that silenced the entire beach. They came to a synchronized halt, and 6 figures in crisp black suits emerged. They moved with the quiet confidence of federal agents. These were not local cops. This was a different kind of power. Leading them was a tall, imposing man named Agent Thornwood. He had worked with Darius for over a decade. He knew exactly who he was. Keisha looked up, tears blurring her vision as the agent strode towards them. "Darius?" she whispered, a flicker of impossible hope igniting within her. Murphy saw the federal presence and bristled. "Great, more complications," he muttered. But Stevens saw the badges and the cold, professional expressions, and a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Agent Thornwood stopped directly in front of Murphy. His voice was low, steady, and carried the full weight of federal authority. "Release that man, immediately." Murphy, still drowning in his own arrogance, made his final, fatal error. "This is local jurisdiction, Fed boy," he sneered. The insult hung in the air. Darius, still in handcuffs, looked Murphy directly in the eye. His voice was calm, but it resonated with an authority that dwarfed everyone on that beach. "Officer," he said, "I am Special Agent in Charge Darius Blackwell, FBI Counterterrorism Division." As he spoke, Agent Thornwood stepped forward, holding up Darius's credentials. The gold shield and formal identification gleamed in the sun, undeniable and absolute. The silence that fell was profound. The only sound was the rhythm of the waves. Keisha stopped crying, her mind struggling to comprehend the tectonic shift that had just occurred. She watched as the men who had been tormenting her husband seemed to shrink before her eyes. The color drained from Murphy's face. In that single, horrifying moment, he saw his career, his pension, his entire world evaporate. He had arrested one of the highest-ranking officials in federal law enforcement. Agent Thornwood's next words hammered the final nail in his coffin. "You just arrested the head of the FBI Counterterrorism Division," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension, ensuring every single person understood the gravity of what had just transpired. Stevens, who had been a bundle of nerves throughout the encounter, moved with a sudden, desperate urgency. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys to the handcuffs, his apologies a torrent of panicked words. "Sir, I'm so sorry, sir," he repeated, the phrase becoming a frantic mantra as if saying it enough could rewind time and erase the colossal blunder. "We had no idea, we were just responding to a call." But his words were hollow, a flimsy shield against the truth. They should have known. They should have done their jobs. They should have investigated before allowing prejudice to write their report. Keisha watched the scene unfold in stunned disbelief. She saw the swagger and aggression melt away from the officers, replaced by a desperate, fawning deference. The very men who had treated her family like violent criminals were now practically bowing, scrambling to cover their tracks. Brielle, who had been so smug in her victory, so certain in her accusations, was now staring at a reality that had just detonated her entire narrative. "That's impossible!" she shrieked, her voice thin and sharp with desperation. "He's lying. That badge is a fake. People like him don't get to be FBI chiefs." But with every word, she only cemented her image as a fool and a bigot. The federal credentials were real. The agents now surrounding Darius, their presence an unspoken threat, were real, and her entire worldview was crumbling around her. The assembled crowd, once a murmur of suspicion, was now a chorus of gasps. A sea of phones rose, recording every second, capturing the spectacular collision of racial profiling and federal authority. Amidst the chaos, little Amara, whose hysterical sobs had torn at her parents' hearts, looked up at the sea of agents in dark suits. With the pure logic of a child, she asked, "Daddy, are all these people here to help us?" It was a question of such profound innocence, an attempt to make sense of a world turned upside down, where the police were the villains and federal agents the saviors, where her father could be a criminal one moment and one of the most powerful men in the country the next. The instant the cuffs were off, Darius's first move was to pull his trembling wife and traumatized daughter into his arms. His family came first. Always. "I was so scared, Darius," Keisha whispered, her body collapsing against his as she took her first real breath since the nightmare began. "I know, baby," he murmured, holding them both tight. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." But after a long moment, once his family was secure in the circle of his arms, Darius turned his attention back to the officers. They had just handed him a perfect, real-world case study of the very injustice he dedicated his life to dismantling. "Officers," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of his authority and disappointment, "you have just demonstrated exactly why I investigate civil rights violations for a living." The words struck Murphy and Stevens like physical blows. They understood, in that chilling moment, that this was no longer about a single bad stop. This was about a pattern of behavior that was now under a federal microscope. But the revelations were far from over. Agent Thornwood stepped forward, ready to turn the situation from a disaster into a reckoning. "Furthermore," Thornwood announced to the stunned onlookers, "I need to inform everyone that Ms. Brielle Ashworth has been under federal surveillance as part of an ongoing investigation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The woman who had started it all was a federal target. "Her vacation rental properties," Thornwood continued, "have been linked to a significant money laundering operation. Her pattern of discriminatory behavior toward minority renters has also been well documented as part of our civil rights inquiry." Brielle's face drained of all color, shifting from rage red to terror white. She realized, with dawning horror, that while she was busy harassing an innocent family, the federal government had been quietly building a case that would destroy her. Additionally, Thornwood said, his gaze locking onto Murphy, Officer Murphy's history of racial profiling complaints is now considered evidence in multiple federal cases. In that instant, Murphy knew this wasn't just the end of his career. It was the beginning of a federal prosecution that could send him to prison. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been completely upended. The family treated as suspects were revealed to be public servants of the highest order. The accuser was a criminal. The arresting officers were now facing federal charges. What began as a hateful act of racism on a quiet street had escalated into a national incident, a stark lesson in how quickly the truth can bring the powerful to their knees. The aftermath was swift. Within minutes, Murphy was suspended, his badge and weapon confiscated. Stevens, seeing his future flash before his eyes, began cooperating immediately, detailing Murphy's long history of bigotry. And Brielle, the architect of the chaos, found herself in the same handcuffs she had so eagerly wished upon another, arrested for fraud and civil rights violations. Child Services arrived, offering horrified apologies for having been used as a weapon in a racist attack. Department heads scrambled to the scene, desperate to personally apologize to FBI Chief Darius Blackwell for the outrage his family had endured. But institutional justice couldn't heal the personal trauma. Keisha was still shaking. "I thought they were going to hurt you," she whispered to Darius, her voice breaking. "Take you away from us." I'm sorry, he said again, holding her. I'm so sorry our daughter had to see that. Amara looked up at her mother. Mommy, why were you so scared? It was a heartbreaking question from a child who had just been robbed of her innocence. I have never, Keisha said, the words heavy with the memory, been so terrified in my life. As the full story emerged, it became even more shocking. Darius revealed this wasn't random. His family's vacation had intentionally coincided with the climax of a multi-state investigation into rental discrimination. Brielle Ashworth's properties, he explained, were a key part of the pattern we've been tracking for months. The community reeled. Neighbors offered heartfelt apologies. The tourism board went into full-blown panic. Spurred by the news, other minority families came forward, their stories revealing Brielle's was just the tip of a very ugly iceberg. And so, with a team of federal agents providing a protective bubble, Amara finally got her dream beach day. The community, desperate to make amends, rallied around them. And in the crucible of that shared crisis, the Blackwell family's bond grew stronger than ever. The impact was transformative. Murphy was fired, convicted, and imprisoned. The local police department was placed under federal oversight. Brielle's rental empire crumbled. And as news cameras rolled, the Blackwells shared their story with the world. My wife was terrified. My daughter was traumatized, Darius said, his gaze steady. This should never happen to any family. Keisha added, no one should have to endure that kind of terror on vacation. Then Amara, holding her father's hand, delivered the simplest, most powerful summary of all. The bad people went away, she said, and the good people helped us. 6 months later, the Blackwell family returned to that same beach. They were welcomed not as outsiders, but as heroes who had forced a community to confront its own ugliness. What began as a vicious, racist attack had become a catalyst for nationwide change, a powerful testament that even in the darkest of moments, justice can, and sometimes does, prevail.